Good evening, friends, and welcome to this concluding press briefing on the India-Africa Forum Summit. The third IAFS has just concluded. You all would have seen Prime Minister's closing statement. This was the first India-Africa Forum Summit in which all 54 African countries had been invited, so it was a totally path-breaking initiative, and you saw the tremendous level of participation from Africa. To brief you now on the outcomes, the very significant outcomes of the summit, I have with me Secretary West, Shri Navtej Sarna, and Joint Secretary ISA, Shri Tanmay Lal. Secretary West will give you the perspective on the two summit documents that have been adopted, the political declaration and the framework of cooperation. Thereafter, he will do a broad-based briefing on the bilaterals that Prime Minister had today, and then we can dive into the question and answer session. So with that, the floor is Secretary West's.
Thank you, Vikas. Good evening, friends. Thank you for patiently waiting for us. We've just concluded a very historic summit. It is the third India-Africa Forum Summit, but it's the first of its kind. This is the first time that we have had the presence of leaders from all 54 African countries in New Delhi, and of course the presence of the chairperson of the African Union Commission. You've all been following this summit closely, so I don't need to go into details of all the statements that were made. You already have copies, I'm sure, of all the statements. But just to say that all the heads of state, government, vice presidents, as well as the chairperson of the African Union Commission spoke today, besides, of course, Prime Minister of India, Shri Narendra Modi. So we actually had 43 speakers today. Just give you the programmatic detail. Beside the 43 speakers, we had the adoption, the formal adoption of the political declaration, as well as the India-Africa Strategic Framework of Cooperation. There was also the release of the special stamp to commemorate the summit, as well as the release of the special coin, which has been issued by the Government of India to commemorate this historic summit. And this was done by the Prime Minister together with Chairperson of the AU, President Mugabe of Zimbabwe, the Chairperson of the AU Commission, Mrs. Zuma, and of course the Finance Minister and the External Affairs Minister and the Minister of State for External Affairs were present, besides Secretary Sports, who presented this stamp. This concludes the formal part of the summit. There is a banquet by the President this evening, for which the leaders will now be reaching. And of course, on parallel to all this, there have been a string of bilateral meetings, both at the Prime Ministerial level as well as the Foreign Minister level. And there have been a few calls also at the President level. So we'll give you these details by and by, but I think what's important is you already have the Prime Minister's statement, and I'm sure it's been reported at length already. The major announcements that have been made are part of the comprehensive perspective that we have taken on Africa, which is built into the rest of the statement. So I would request you not only to look at the last paragraph, but to go back and see the depth of engagement on which those announcements are pegged. This is also the spirit behind the two documents which will now be available with you. if you see the declaration, it reflects the common themes that we have heard throughout the day today. Essentially, the themes that both Africa and India are at a very important stage in terms of not only their own development, but how they engage with each other for mutual benefit. Clearly, this is a historic stepping stone to a greater engagement. The context of the summit is important. This is India-Africa engaging like never before in numbers. It comes few months after the adoption of Agenda 2063 by the African leaders. It comes just a month before COP21, something which is of critical interest not only to India but to African countries, whether they are desert or semi-desert countries, whether they are small island states, whether they are countries which are at a certain stage of development that if they have to go green, they need finances and technology and the means of development and assistance for that. So there are all sorts of perspectives merging into the climate change debate, which you have heard about today. It comes just a month before the WTO meeting in Nairobi. Trade has been a major theme that we have heard throughout the day. Not only India-Africa trade, which incidentally has doubled in the last 5 years and multiplied many-fold in the last 15 years to reach a very impressive figure of about $72 billion. So how the world is moving towards an equitable trade regime is something which is of very great importance. The documents touch on many themes. They touch on the commonalities between India and Africa. They touch on the priorities of sustainable development so that we are aligning our moves, our priorities, our means of implementation with what the UN has decided with the cooperation of all of us as the Sustainable Development Agenda 2030. The documents also talk of major challenges. They talk of terrorism and the need to counter this in a broader context of peace and security. Conflict is the enemy of development. Terrorism is the enemy of development. So when we are working together for development, we also have to work against conflict. We also have to work against terrorism. So there has been a call in the declaration to work together on all kinds of terrorism. There is no excuse. There should be zero tolerance for terrorism. There has been a reflection here to how we engage together more in peace and security efforts like peacekeeping, at which India has already been deeply engaged with Africa, having participated in 11 peacekeeping operations there, but also in terms of strengthening the African peacekeeping efforts. And a greater gender consciousness is being brought into peacekeeping. Gender consciousness brings me to the idea of women empowerment, which is again reflected in the documents. This is something which is of tremendous importance to all of us. Energy is another area which finds a lot of attention and focus, and particularly renewable energy. There are also areas which I would attract your attention to, which are of emerging interest to Africa. For instance, the blue economy. And you'll find that attention here, because there are not only the island countries, also the coastal countries. Africa, if I'm not wrong, has about 26,000 kilometer long coastline. And the ocean is a huge, huge asset in terms of providing energy, in terms of sustainable fisheries, in terms of biodiversity. It's also a challenge in terms of security, maritime security. Engagement of India and Africa on maritime security has been extensive. We've done anti-piracy patrols by the Indian Navy for years, very successfully. We've provided protection where necessary to coastal states. We've built up capacity in several African countries by equipment and training and cooperation to build up the inherent maritime security capabilities of these countries. We've done hydrographic surveys for several countries which contribute, and this is something which is a felt need, clearly. And let me tell you that the entire approach behind the documents has been, let's work together in areas where we both want to work together. Let's work together in areas which are our strengths. So it's a partnership of mutual benefit based on mutual strengths. Capacity building is a very important area. You heard this morning, the Honorable Prime Minister of India announced that in the next 5 years, there will be 50,000 scholarships. Now, with each of our African interlocutors, there has been this felt need that India should provide more training. We do it virtually, we do it physically. We have a Pan-African network which the Prime Minister announced would be expanded. We already have it in 48 countries and we've had it successfully for a few years. It's both for education and for health. So within this 50,000 scholarship, you will see the core of an eventual India-Africa virtual university. You had the other announcements by the Prime Minister, and this is again reflected in these documents. The Prime Minister announced $10 billion of fresh concessional credits, lines of credit, over the next 5 years. This follows up on what we've already done. We've already approved about $7.4 billion US dollars over the since the first summit, and $9 billion if you go back 10 years. Out of that, we are already working on 137 projects in 41 countries. So now, the fresh lines of credit, what would they be used for? You'll find that reflection in the strategic framework. There's a need for infrastructure building. There's a repeated need we have heard for electrification, rural electrification. As the Prime Minister said, when the sun sets, hundreds and thousands of homes in India and Africa go dark. So we have to work together. Solar electrification. There's a need for healthcare, for building hospitals. There's a need for industry and creation of jobs. Sugar plants. We've been asked by many countries that, look, we have sugar, we can't process it. So can we work together to set up sugar plants and create jobs? And creation of jobs is critical. You had 65% of the population of Africa is under 35. This is something which is the same situation virtually in India. So when the Prime Minister said that 1/3 of humanity was represented in that room today, it means that a large preponderance of that 1/3 of humanity is very young. And they need jobs. So industry, the creation of employment, these will be the purposes of this concessional credit. We You also heard of the announcement of $600 million US dollars as grant. But this is essentially institution building. We have several institutions already being worked on, and the next tranche of grants will go for the expansion of some of those institutions where we have felt that the money budgeted for them was not enough. So we have to put more money, as well as $100 million India-Africa Development Fund, which is part of this larger grant, which will be development projects which are agreed with our bilateral and African partners, which they would like to see on a regional basis or on a continental basis. And these are ideas which will now work out. The way this process moves is, now that the summit has ended, now that we have the documents, we will engage with the African Union, who would get inputs from all countries, and we will work out a joint action plan. In this joint action plan, we have already done an extensive review of our earlier projects. We will see how many of them have succeeded and those which are slow, the reasons thereof, and see how we can finish those and add more. So this is a process which is an interactive, bilateral process with the African Union representatives, which we will work out in the next few months. Agriculture was another area which has had a lot of focus, because Africa remains, most countries remain agriculture-based economies. They're net importer of food as a continent. There's got a wealth of arable land, wealth of water, and yet there is need for better farm management, farm mechanization, smart agriculture, agricultural workforce. Now, these are all things which India and Africa can work together. There are agriculture products in Africa which need greater market access. We already have a duty-free scheme for least developed countries. It has a certain coverage. It's almost there. It's got 98% coverage. We are working to see how we can expand that even further, so that all the countries who are so entitled will get duty-free access to Indian markets. I think more or less, have I left? More or less I have touched upon most subject. Yes, there was a very important aspect, which is cooperation in multilateral fora. There was a great empathy of views throughout the day on certain multilateral issues. For instance, the reforms of the UN Security Council. You heard many voices say that the UN Security Council does not spell out the geopolitical realities of the world today, and there is a drastic need for reform. So you will find reflection of the positions. Without India and Africa in the UN Security Council, the UN Security Council is incomplete. That was the short message that came out of the bilateral meetings, that came out of the statements that we heard in the plenary session. So there is a understanding of each other's positions. There is an agreement that the recent text-based resolution that has been adopted by a decision in the UNGA, that henceforth the negotiations should be conducted on the basis of a text which the intergovernmental process has brought out. That was a consensus US resolution, and there was an agreement there should be an early implementation of this decision, and we should work towards concrete outcomes. There was climate change I've already mentioned, but again you will find that there is a good formulation on which everybody agreed on how we are going to approach the coming climate change negotiations, that while we are all willing to do our bit, there has to be an understanding for the basic principles of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, on the need for technical and financial means of implementation, transfer of technology and provision of financial means, so that the countries can fulfill their responsibilities on a common but differentiated basis. There was a lot of discussion about good governance, and I must attract your attention to the fact of the resurgent spirit in Africa, not only in terms of several fast-growing economies, but an increasing number of mature democracies. And this was a theme which is praiseworthy and on which further cooperation was outlined. We sometimes find criticism that Indian and African summits are there and then nothing happens. How do we figure out how much has happened or not happened? Well, now we've instituted a monitoring mechanism, which you will see in the document. This monitoring mechanism will be spelled out when we have our bilateral negotiations, and this will give additional teeth to this entire process of commitment and implementation. I think I have covered the highlights of this, and I would now give you a flavor of the bilateral meetings that Prime Minister of India held today. The Prime Minister had meetings with the President of Egypt, with His Majesty the King of Morocco, Prime Minister of Namibia, Prime Minister of Mali, Prime Minister of Ethiopia, the Prime Minister of Somalia, the Prime Minister of Mauritania, Prime Minister of Angola, the Vice President of Tanzania, and the Prime Minister of Comoros. In addition, as you know, there were 19 meetings which the Prime Minister held yesterday bilaterally, and 12 meetings which the Foreign Minister did yesterday. There was some mix-up in the figures in this morning's papers, so that is why I'm clarifying this. There were 19 meetings by Prime Minister, 12 meetings with Foreign Minister, and the present bilaterals I've given you today. The bilaterals will continue tomorrow. So both at the Prime Minister's level and Foreign Minister's level. So by the time the summit actually ends in terms of people departing, we are trying that each of the leaders has met the Prime Minister, and all the requests for calls at the Foreign Minister level are fulfilled. Now the meetings, the bilateral meetings today provided a good opportunity for the leaders to discuss in an informal and a smaller setting some of the themes which we were discussing in the plenary. Each country has its own focus, naturally. Some are landlocked countries, some are island states, some countries need more capacity building, some have already got lines of credit, some are in a position that they have difficulty in taking lines of credit because of certain IMF conditionalities. Some have got major problems of terrorism which is threatening their territorial integrity and peace. There are some countries which had problems of desertification. There are some countries who need defense capabilities, they need training, they need institutional building. So these were many of the things that came up today. There are several, the discussions also covered several ongoing projects, like we have institutions coming up in various countries. So if there was a problem with that, that was discussed. What I must say, I mean, if you like, I think Vikas has detailed notes on each meeting and he would be able to give you that. But I think what I'd like to say is this was something also which has not been done before. That the leaders could meet one after the other with the Prime Minister today and go through very quickly a review of the entire bilateral relationship and highlight what was needed. They could give a good feedback to each other on what needed to be done more, drawbacks if any, and what this gives a personalized feel to the relationship. It gives an idea as very closely as to our leader also and to their leaders also. This is what we can do for each other. So that was that. If you like, if there are any questions, be happy to answer or try to answer. Yes, please. Yes, Vijay.
So we are talking about very close relations between India and Africa, and every leader today talked about it, you see. But I wonder why we are increasing the time, you see, between two summits. First we had in 2008, that after that it was 3 years. Then we had a summit at 2015, 4 years, and now the Prime Minister has said that the next summit would be after 5 years. I just want to know what is the logic behind, or what is the thinking that has gone in behind.
No, I'll answer that. No, there was no reduction in the previous time. It was 2008, then 2011, and it was supposed to be 2014. And it did not happen for a very valid reason, which you know, not because of a lack of desire on either party. There was, in our discussions during which these documents, you see, did not appear out of the blue, nor were they actually all framed and negotiated in the last 2 days. If we give you that impression, I'm happy. It makes us look more efficient. But these documents have been in preparation for about 3 months. We have had visits to Addis Ababa, discussions with African Union on each point, proposals and counter-proposals. Now, there was an understanding that, look, we need a bigger gap and a monitoring so that we can actually get things done in that period. Institutions take time to build. So this was actually a proposal which we received in Addis, that the next summit, we should have a 5-year gap. And we looked at it and we thought it made sense that we have set up such a huge agenda. Let's give ourselves time. The Prime Minister said in his closing statement, I'd like you to read that closing statement, that the next summit will be 5 years, but our engagement with Africa will be constant. Yes, please.
Sir, linked to the previous question again, the fact that it's at one level we appear to be more realistic when we're saying that.
Could you identify yourself?
Yeah, Charu Kasturi from the Telegraph. Just wanted to understand, the 5-year gap that we're now planning to give between summits. Is there a time when, some other countries like Japan has actually reduced the time it wants to have between summits with Africa? Aren't we sending, in a sense, a signal that we aren't able to deliver our promises in the time?
I just answered that question. I'll answer it again. This was a mutual agreement. The signal was that I don't think frequency of summits is what people want. The African Union has made us very, very clear when they made the Agenda 2063. And let me confide with you that the African Union is examining each partnership. They are currently in that process of analytically focusing on each partnership and aligning it with Agenda 2063 and seeing what they want from each country, what are the strengths from their continent country partnership comparatively. They do not want that the partners simply walk in and say, okay, this is what we can do and this is what we are doing. They want to engage with partners and to say, thank you very much, you are doing this, but so-and-so is also doing this. Would you rather not do this? Because you are good at this, we need this. This is the kind of conversations we are having. And I do not want to compare somebody does it after 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. We are not into competition of summit frequency. We have a partnership to build with Africa, and the summit is an occasion for a high-level impetus. It is not the process itself. The process is a daily process.
On the on the UNSC reform, whether this document specifies anything about veto power? Because today we heard President Mugabe was saying that if we don't get veto power, then veto power should be abolished. So what is the India's view on that, and whether any mention about it?
There is, you see, the political declaration is framed in very broad terms. It doesn't get into each aspect of negotiations. We are not negotiating with Africa. We are all on the same side. We have to negotiate in the larger framework when in New York. As you know, Gautam, very, very well, the whole issue of UN Security Council has several aspects. It's 5 clusters, actually. It's the size of the membership, it's the issue of veto, it's the issue of relationship between General Assembly and Security Council, it's the issue of regional representation, it's the issue of transparency. So these all are clusters on which there's no point having a very fixed position on each issue. Every country has a position. It expresses it in different fora, in different forms. These things will essentially work out when we actually have a negotiation in the intergovernmental negotiating group. Yes, we heard several several speakers. You will see a reference to the African position in the document, which is contained in the Ezulvini consensus, which of course has a veto. You will also see references to India's aspirations and positions and capabilities towards becoming a Security Council member. But essentially, we did not get into details about, because what is the point of negotiating with each other? We are both out of the Security Council. We need to negotiate with people who are in the Security Council. Yes, please. I'll come to you. Okay. I'll take both. Don't worry. Yeah.
So one small connecting question. 54 countries were here.
Could you identify yourself?
So I'm Siddhant from Doordarshan News. So there were 54 countries here. We talked about UNSC reforms. Can you give us figures? How many countries have supported India's bid for the UN seat? I mean, out of 54 countries. Pretty direct question, but I mean.
I'm sorry. I'm not going to be able to give you arithmetic. You've heard all the statements. You would have seen the statements. This was not a summit on UN Security Council reforms. So is one of the aspects which came up for discussion when we look at the global landscape, is one of the issues. There is terrorism, which is a global phenomenon. There is cyber security. There is disease. There is pandemics. There is climate change. So this is, it is, when we have a summit on UN Security Council reforms, I promise you I'll produce you a mark sheet at the end of the day. Right.
ताना सर, मेरा सवाल मैं निमिष कुमार हूं, हिंदुस्तान समाचार न्यूज एजेंसी से। 54 आउट ऑफ 54 एक बहुत बढ़िया रिस्पांस आप लोगों को मिला और दोनों ही पक्षों ने इस बात पर आइडेंटिफाई किया है कि किन एरियाज में उन लोगों को आपकी मदद चाहिए भारत सरकार की और भारत सरकार किन एरियाज में उनकी मदद कर सकता है। ये क्लियर हो चुका है, प्रधानमंत्री ने भी कहा और हमारी विदेश मंत्री ने भी बताया, जिसमें एजुकेशन है, मेडिकल कैपेसिटी बिल्डिंग है, सभी एरियाज में। अब आप लोगों का प्लान ऑफ एक्शन क्या होगा? एग्जीक्यूशन कैसे करेंगे? क्या गवर्नमेंट एजेंसीज करेंगी, क्या प्राइवेट एजेंसीज करेंगी?
देखिए, पहली बात तो मैं ये स्पष्ट कर दूं आपको कि ये एक तरफी रिलेशनशिप नहीं है कि अफ्रीका को हमारी जरूरत है इन चीजों में। ये ऐसा इंप्रेशन पूरी तरह से करेक्ट नहीं है कि कई चीजों में अफ्रीकी देशों को जरूरत है, कई चीजों में हमको भी देखना है कि अफ्रीका रिसर्जेंट कॉन्टिनेंट है। अगले कुछ साल में अफ्रीका कहां होगा? अफ्रीका एक बहुत बड़ी मार्केट है हमारे गुड्स के लिए। अफ्रीका एक इन्वेस्टमेंट डेस्टिनेशन। अफ्रीका ऐसा एक कॉन्टिनेंट है जिसमें इतना, जैसे मैंने आपको बताया, 65% यूथ पावर है। तो ये हमारी पार्टनरशिप है एक तरह की। सो ये एक तरफी रिलेशनशिप को कभी कोई सक्सेसफुल नहीं होती। जैसे लोगों में वैसे ही देशों में दो तरफी रिलेशनशिप होती है। अब आपका सवाल रहा कि हम कैसे इसको करेंगे। ये कोई नई बात नहीं है कैसे करेंगे, क्योंकि ऑलरेडी हम ये 10 साल से कर रहे हैं, तो सिस्टम्स बने हुए हैं। अब इसका एक प्लान ऑफ एक्शन बनेगा, एक फ्रेश लिस्ट ऑफ इंस्टीट्यूट्स बनेगी, उसको रिव्यू किया जाएगा। कई चीजों में सरकारी कंपनियां काम करती हैं, कई चीजों में प्राइवेट सेक्टर काम करता है। तो जैसे कुछ आपको इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर सेटअप करना है तो वो प्राइवेट सेक्टर वाले करेंगे, जहां BHEL भी पिच कर सकता है वो भी करेगा, ONGC विदेश भी कर सकता है वो भी करेगा। तो ये तो जैसे इशू होता है वैसे हो।
Sir, on the question of terrorism, can we expect that African nations are going to support our resolution on terrorism, and do they agree with our position on the whole question of terrorism?
I think you will find, Akhilesh, in the declaration a full paragraph which is a common position. It's an agreed position on terrorism. I'll advise you to read it. It talks of, it says that we will promote the strengthening of the UN counterterrorism mechanisms. We'll call upon all states to ensure strict compliance with UN Security Council sanctions regime on terrorism, and call on all countries to ensure that their territories are not used for cross-border terrorist activities. We urge international community to cooperate with urgency to adopt the Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism within the 70th session of UNGA. This is an agreed position. Yes.
सर, मैं मनीष झा हूँ इंडिया टीवी से। एक अच्छा समिट ऑर्गेनाइज करने के लिए आप लोगों को बहुत बहुत बधाई। अब इस समिट में 2 प्रोग्राम थे, एक कल PM का डिनर था और आज प्रेसिडेंट का बैंक्वेट भी है। और डोमेस्टिक लेवल पर एक कंट्रोवर्सी इसको लेकर सामने आ रही है कि आपने जो सबसे बड़ी अपोजिशन पार्टी है उसके प्रेसिडेंट को डिनर पर इग्नोर कर दिया, या क्या है इसको लेकर अगर आप फैक्ट सामने रख सके तो।
देखिए, I don't think I'm going to get into political questions. I am here to give you the thrust of the success and the substantive content of this summit. If you want to politicize this in some way, I'm afraid I am not going to be in a position to help you.
I'm Harun Riaz from Diplomacy in Focus magazine. I have 3 questions. First question is about air connectivity. It's a long pending complaint, and the Indian exporters, they have been complaining about the lack of air connectivity. The air freight charges have gone as much as 500%. So I'm surprised this issue has not been discussed.
This issue was discussed, but not in the immediate summit. This is a question which comes up in many bilateral conversations. There is a need for direct air connectivity. We absolutely agree. We are encouraging. Air connectivity is ultimately based on commercial factors. So we are encouraging several airlines to go and have conversations and look at the business possibilities.
And very recently, Mr. Sarna, when you announced, you held a press conference and said that we have brotherly ties with Africa. But when we look at Indian government's visa on arrival facility, India is giving visa on arrival only to 6 countries, but 16 African countries are giving this facility to Indian citizens. So what is the criteria? Can we see more African countries on this list?
Again, you find a reference in the framework document. It says facilitate air and maritime connectivity and more liberal visa procedures and visa concessions to enhance tourism, trade, and other people-to-people contacts. So this is a decision. This will be now promoted and examined and implemented. Yes, please. I'll take one question because we have a banquet there. I'll be stopped. The roads are blocked.
Tirthankar from Radio France International. I have just one question. Hello. Yeah. Can you hear me? My question is this. I think you were probably at the Africa desk in 2008, and today, 7 years later, 2015, you are at the Africa desk.
Sorry, I couldn't get your question.
You were at the Africa desk in
No.
2008.
No, I wasn't. No.
You are not?
No.
I see.
I wish I was, but I wasn't.
But you said the other day that you looked after the editors' meeting in 2008.
I was doing his job, so I was handling more important things. I was handling the press.
Okay, in that case, just my question is this: what has changed between 2008 and 2015 in India-Africa relations?
Difference.
Yes. What has changed?
Well, I think there is a qualitative change in the level of engagement. Simply, if you take 7 years, your trade has doubled. There's huge investment, which is recent. We have $30 to $35 billion investment. There is a greater level of stability. There's in the relationship. There's a greater understanding of new possibilities. Like this entire area of the blue economy is brand new. There, of course, some things move, like, it's an evolving landscape, like terrorism, disease, health. These are some things. Our Pan-Africa thing, for instance, the network, satellite network, was not there. Now it is there and it has succeeded. We have large number, our healthcare facilities have improved. So we have large number of health tourists coming to India. The entire development of cooperation in maritime security has happened in these years. So I could go on, but there are, it's a qualitatively different engagement. Last question.
Sir, this is Mohit from NNI's news agency. So the emergence of terrorist group in Africa has been a matter of great concern for the African nations, like emergence of groups like Boko Haram. What kind of cooperation India has or assurance India has given to the African nations that they will help in this regard, sir?
I think I've just read out the cooperation. The essential thought behind cooperation against terrorism is that it is not one person's or one country's problem. The nature of global terrorism today needs a global response. So the more cooperation you have, the more information sharing you have, the more sharing of financial sources of terrorists you have, the better equipped countries are to counter this scourge. So it was highlighted, there is training, there is cooperation, there is information sharing, and there is the building of an international norm. All these aspects were discussed upon. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'll just brief you on the